Welcome back to the PSPub. What can be said about Final Fantasy and the franchise as a whole that hasn't really already been said? It's one of my favorite franchises of all time, and I think as a whole their track record speaks for itself. Not everything has been a hit, but it's hard to argue their place in video game history, especially for RPGs, at least in my opinion. So I'm excited to finally start talking about this franchise in any capacity, and in a way I think it's kind of apropos that Final Fantasy I be the first traditional RPG that I review on this channel. Although to be fair, my original plan was to cover Untold Legends, but that's on a slight hold at the moment till I can get that silly XGP to jump in and do co-op with me.
It's a dud!
And I guess also technically Rengoku had a lot of RPG elements, but strictly speaking from a traditional RPG standpoint. Still, this will be a bit different than my typical review, as I'm sure you've undoubtedly heard about this game ad nauseum, so I'd like to tell you about my feelings going through this classic. Being transparent here, you're probably not going to hear anything profound about Final Fantasy I that you can't hear from other channels like, oh, the secrets of such and such and things you may have missed from Final Fantasy I, but for what it's worth, I hope you appreciate my feelings as I express my love as a whole for this particular franchise. If you are interested in stuff that goes into a lot more depth when it comes to Final Fantasy, just some of the big channels off the top of my head that I can think of: Final Fantasy Union, 4-8 Productions, Last Elixir Productions, Game Dove, and there's a lot of different great Final Fantasy content creators out there that can dive a bit more into the weeds when it comes to specifics on this franchise. But for what it's worth, I hope you appreciate my feelings as I express my love for this franchise, as we'll be covering the game's main plot and progression from beginning to end. So since this is a special occasion, I'm whipping out the top shelf whiskey on this one because it's going to be a bit of a longer video. So grab your drinks and let's sip to the occasion. This is Final Fantasy 20th Anniversary Edition. When it came time for Square Enix to celebrate the 20th anniversary of its most popular franchise, to quote John Hammond,
"Spared no expense."
Launching new games, merch, and a brand/marketing initiative that was fairly large in scope around this grand milestone. Adding the 20th anniversary branding we see here. It's one of the things I appreciate about Square when it comes to some of their franchises' anniversaries. Not all of them get this treatment, mind you, but they do go all out for Final Fantasy. As you can see here, even my copy of Final Fantasy XII received the 30th anniversary branding when it was re-released on modern consoles at the time. And in 2 years, I imagine we will get the 40th anniversary branding as well. Still, speaking of Final Fantasy XII, some of the titles released during this time frame were Final Fantasy XII International Zodiac Job System, which would become part of the Final Fantasy XII Zodiac Age 30th anniversary re-release over here in the West. The 20th anniversary also spawned the Final Fantasy IV DS remake, which took inspiration from the Final Fantasy III DS remake, not 3DS remake, just the Final Fantasy number 3 DS remake. Most obviously, of course, though, would be today's game, Final Fantasy I and II, both on the PSP. We also received a PSP port of Final Fantasy Tactics entitled War of the Lions. But last and certainly most not least, we also received the ultimate crossover at the time for Final Fantasy fans in Dissidia Final Fantasy. So really, there was a lot to be excited about in terms of new game releases, and this doesn't even account for Final Fantasy VII, who was having its own 10-year anniversary in 2007 as well, which saw releases via the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, which arguably kicked off the whole anniversary of Final Fantasy VII when it was released in 2005, with subsequent releases of Dirge of Cerberus in 2006 and Crisis Core in 2007. In a way, I think there could be an argument to be made that Final Fantasy VII's anniversary was done in a way that kind of unintentionally overshadowed a lot of the mainline celebrations at the time. However, that's purely my own opinion on that one. If you were a Final Fantasy fan at the time like I was, it was amazing seeing all the new Final Fantasy media being released. For the 20th anniversary of Final Fantasy, Square would mark this momentous occasion when a special 20th anniversary celebration party was held at the Mokuhari Messe Convention Center in Chiba Prefecture of Japan. I apologize if I butchered the language, but if you were lucky lucky enough to attend this event, then you were in for a real treat if you were a fan of Final Fantasy like I am. The celebration was held between May 12th through the 13th, and between both those days, 76,562 fans flocked to the convention center to try out demos for upcoming releases, as well as check out new and exclusive merch and celebrate the franchise as a whole. This is a slight tangent, but I promise it will relate. But back in 2023, my fiance and I were in Japan, and we got to see the life-size RX-79 Gundam that was at the pier in Yokohama, which was awesome, and glad we got to do it, especially now that it's been unfortunately removed from that location. However, upon entering, there was a cool walkthrough which talked about and celebrated the history of Gunpla and Gundam as a whole. Although it wasn't a huge area, they still crammed a lot in terms of history and merch if you were a fan. Going back almost 20 years now, at the time Square took this concept and made it nothing short of grand, taking over most of the convention center from what I can tell, but also offering a similar experience with a walkthrough museum of sorts where they had every Japanese release for the different Final Fantasy titles out on display here that you could check out. At the time, the 20th anniversary edition PSP ports were not out yet, but you were able to get a sneak peek at them here. And still, I can't stress enough to the scale of this, as there were live concerts, demo halls to play games, watch trailers to upcoming games, huge merch stands of stuff that I would have loved to have bought back in the day, but are probably insanely expensive to get now, like these Advent Children statues of Cloud and Sephiroth. There were even appearances by Dragon Quest and Star Ocean here, so if you were a fan of Square Enix in general, there was a lot to enjoy here, especially since it was a free event to get into. There's a fantastic write-up on this 20th anniversary party by FinalFantasyMerch.wix site, which you'll see the link on the screen, as well as I'll have it linked below for you guys to check out. And you absolutely should, because the write-up here is fantastic, taking you all the way back to this event. They do state that there were quite a bit of long lines, especially for the demo kiosks of upcoming games, and I imagine that a lot of that dealt with like Crisis Core, but I promise you this, I would have loved to have gone just to enjoy the atmosphere of this all. Still, if you get a chance, like I mentioned, definitely check out this write-up. It's not super long, and if you are a fan of Final Fantasy, you'll appreciate it. The fact that this PSP remake and update is the 20th anniversary of the first Final Fantasy game truly blows my mind. And want to hear something even funnier? We are less than 2 years away from the 20th anniversary of this game, as it was released in May of 2007. Yep, I'll be taking an extra sip of whiskey after that one. As a matter of fact, let me just polish this one off and get another one going. When loading up the game for the first time, we get this awesome intro cutscene of the Warrior of Light fighting a dragon with glimpses of the crystal before and at the end of the cinematic. The cinematic itself was originally created for the PS1 game Final Fantasy Origins, which featured both FF1 and 2, although this intro pertained specifically to the former. It is a bit more compressed here in comparison to the PS1 version, but I think it still gets the point across and is just an awesome introduction for the original Final Fantasy. Although I've always thought this intro was kind of funny because of the Dragon Warrior 1 parallels. Not a bad thing, just something I appreciate now more so over the years, especially after the Square and Enix merger. Now, I won't be able to get into all the changes between the multiple versions, as at this point FF1 has been remade and re-released so many times that in a way you're going to get a new experience for pretty much every title in terms of its gameplay mechanics, difficulty, enemies, AI, and essentially everything under the hood. If you are curious as to what all the changes are, thankfully a lot of fans over the years have discussed this ad nauseum on forums, videos, etc. here on the internet. As you can see from this GameFAQs post from 13 years ago, this was a question that was decently talked about. Still, I really enjoy the new graphical style here. It's obviously different from the original NES game, and while I think I prefer the NES look from a nostalgic point of view, I'd be lying if I didn't say I really like all the new sprite work here, from the characters all through the enemies and spell effects. I like the chibi look of the overworld sprites here, and I think it complements the main battle gameplay here quite nicely. That little bit of extra charm here works so well, and it goes a long way in making you appreciate the journey just that little bit more. Not to mention the soundtrack, which is enhanced here, and I'll talk more about that towards the end of the video. The menus here are all great and function nicely as well, with it being very easy to see what you're doing and trying to accomplish without much effort. All in all, the presentation enhancements are great here. At least I enjoy them. As far as the story goes, this will deviate a bit from my normal review style, as I not only wanted to make this one a little bit more special because Final Fantasy is one of my favorite franchises of all time, but I also want to do my due diligence and cover the story and bosses a bit closer here. Of course, I'll keep it as high level as possible, but I thought it'd be easier to just discuss my thoughts throughout the course of the story. So there are points where I'm going to breeze by the story a bit, but that'll probably be because there isn't as much I had to say at that point in the story and the progression of the game. Still, I will be summarizing things and breaking stuff down afterwards in terms of what really stuck out to me. There are timestamps below and on screen so you can skip ahead, but just in case, spoilers going forward from here. This video and other RPG videos may be a bit longer than the average review, but if you like this more in-depth look for RPGs, let me know so I can do so in the future for other RPGs. But if you would prefer an even higher level look at the story instead of this style, I can do that as well, making it more akin to my typical stuff that I do. So let me know in the comments below what you all prefer. RPGs are a bit longer and take more time to get through, so I end up living in these a bit more and often have a lot of thoughts. Not every time, mind you, but anyway, let's get going. I decided to go with the warrior, thief, white mage, and black mage for this run. I know most guys will say to include the monk usually over the thief, which I do like the monk, but I always preferred the look of the thief slash ninja over the monk. I do think it's pretty cool though when looking at all the classes that every single one of these would not only come back as jobs in the future, but every class in the game would have some sort of representation in every Final Fantasy going forward for future games. They are classics for a reason, and I think even today every one of these are still iconic, with the most obviously being the black and white mages respectfully. After we name our characters and start the game proper, we're given an opening cutscene that does a decent job setting up the world as a whole. It's different than the original game, as initially after you select your classes, the game would just kind of drop you in Cornelia and the journey would begin. It's a decent setup here, and I like that it builds just enough lore for this game to get you invested in the world you're about to adventure in. Still true to the original game, our story begins just outside the town of Cornelia, where we have some gold and can equip our comrades. You'll notice right away that while the towns in Final Fantasy 1 will for the most part have similarities in terms of services available via weapons, armor, and magic shops, albeit funny enough there is a small section of the game where you won't have access to an item shop, but for the most part will always be there. Now at this point you'll notice that there's a jump in classes here, and that is because throughout my playthrough I never found myself in a situation where I needed to have access to utilizing the services provided by the church. But after beating the game I went ahead and took out 2 party members, then took them to the church where for a small fee you can have them revived. I do think this is nice, especially if you're new to the game, as reviving a party member early on can be expensive because the cost of 1 Phoenix down is 1,000 gil. Again though, and I can't say this for every single version of Final Fantasy 1, but at least here in this particular playthrough, I really didn't have to worry about it. So truth be told, like I said, I didn't even end up using the church until I had to go back and record this extra bit of footage, because as I was going through the script, I realized, oh yeah, I never walked into any of these churches. Still, as we head to the castle and learn of the captured Cornelia princess by the Dark Knight Garland and head to confront the Mad Knight, you'll learn that the difficulty, at least in this version of Final Fantasy 1, is way lower than other Final Fantasy games. Even after traveling to take out Garland, we managed to quell the knight's wrath in a few hits, saving the Princess of Cornelia and returning her home. Again, a very straightforward opening that was pretty easy for the most part. I think this opening section here should give you a good idea whether or not you will enjoy this game, from the difficulty down to how the storytelling works in game. To me though, I feel it's a classic setup. Everything from receiving the loot from Princess Cornelia to fixing the bridge and getting that classic Final Fantasy song and story crawl. I love it. It has that bit of nostalgia nostalgia that as a Final Fantasy fan, I can't help but find beautiful. Despite not growing up on this particular title, there is something about seeing the four warriors of light overlooking Cornelia as we set forth to begin our quest to recover the four crystals. I think even today it works as a great setup. A bit basic in comparison to most other RPGs today, maybe, but I think even if you are a veteran of JRPGs, you'll still enjoy it. We head northwest from here to a small port town in order to get the pirate ship. However, before we do, I wanted to show off the Peninsula of Power since it is right near here. And yes, the Peninsula of Power is still in this version of the game, as you can see. And just to go ahead and show off the other classes, I also started a brand new game just to get it to this point so you could see other classes here. But for those that don't know, the way the world map is segmented, you're able to go to this tiny peninsula here and fight late game enemies because this little section is technically connected on a grid with stronger enemies. For my playthrough, I decided against using it as I wanted a more casual playthrough to get the full experience. Still, for what it is, and as a slight tangent, I think they should have left this in for all versions of the game. It was patched out in the Pixel Remaster version of the game, and I don't know, I like the idea of the peninsula just kind of being there, even if I'm not one to use it. Having this sort of mythical quality to it that adds just a bit more in terms of the world's overall feeling. Almost like going on a real adventure, you could wander into this sort of forbidden area where only the truly hardened would survive or die trying. Or at the very least, it would teach the player to err on the side of caution when venturing forth into uncharted territories. After some sightseeing in a clearly alternate universe with a PSPub 2 and friends at the peninsula, it was time to obtain our ship in the game and open up another section of the world. So we head to Provoca, beat up a pirate and commandeer his ship. Now we have access to a larger portion of the inland that was blocked off by different map hazards. It's kind of interesting to me that even at the very beginning of the franchise, the series itself would sort of mimic events in later entries. Ship is always first, followed by the airship eventually later on. I'm pretty sure this is the earliest you can also get a ship in the franchise as well, storytelling wise, as even in FF5 you do have to go through quite a bit till you get Ferris. Still, I can appreciate how much the series has evolved from a narrative standpoint while still keeping true to certain tropes, beats, or ideas from all the way back at the franchise's infancy. If you want a good look at the evolutions of a lot of these examples, I mentioned them earlier in the video, but I highly recommend checking out the Final Fantasy Union YouTube channel. I'm subbed and I listen to them quite often, especially during editing, scripting, writing, or even playing the games to receive footage. Highly recommended. But continuing forward, we discover the city of Elfenheim after docking our ship and traversing through the continent. We find that the prince of the castle has been in a deep sleep, and the only clues to their whereabouts of this happening are at a keep not far off in the distance. Now, we do stop and do quite a bit of grinding in Elfenheim in order to stock up on equipment, magic, and items. Again, as I stated before, the game isn't necessarily hard, but it doesn't hurt to stock up on equipment when available, and it's something I normally like to do on a lot of JRPGs early on at the jump in a new adventure, especially here as it allows for us to essentially coast through a lot of the main game with little issues. Before heading to and inside the Marsh Cave, we had grinded all the way up to level 14, so that should give you a pretty good idea of how long I was at it just trying to gather gold. Final Fantasy I 20th Anniversary is a little sneaky when it comes to how expensive its items and gear will be by lulling you into a false sense of security with a relatively inexpensive equipment and such in Cornelia. Still, to be fair, and it's something I do kind of appreciate, but you don't have to buy everything at once. In a way, FF1 feels like a game where you're meant to explore and come back at different points in your adventure. The game's main plot narrative is linear like the rest of the series, but it feels a lot more open, if that makes sense. We're not dealing with anything saga like here, but I do enjoy the open feel of the game overall up to this point, and even more so coming up relatively soon. Still, we learn of a dark elf named Astos, who tricked this by no means shady looking king here in this decrepit old keep. Definitely not shady at all. So we head to the Marsh Cave and eventually stumbled upon a group of pisco demons guarding the dark elf's crown. Up to this point, this was probably the toughest fight we had been in. Grinding for a few extra levels helped here, and after taking the demons out, we finished grabbing the remaining treasure in Marsh and head back to the king who, shocker, was actually the dark elf Astos.
But that's just plain nuts! Many of you out there are thinking, right?
I know. I'm surprised too. Astos was a pretty straightforward fight, and I actually found the Picto Demons to be a trickier fight, but it is what it is. There's a nice touch here I really appreciated where after we defeat Astos, we see the castle change from a dark, kind of scary place to a much more illuminated castle. It's the little details here and a bit later on that I'll touch on that truly makes it feel like your party is making a difference, no matter how small, in the world as a whole. Now, one thing I haven't touched upon yet is how essential talking to the townsfolk is in the game. Obviously nowadays, nowadays we have the added benefit to looking up guides on how to do things, and I try to stay away from them as much as possible so that I can immerse myself in whatever it is I'm playing. I do break that here a bit later on, and I'll touch on that when we get there, but in Final Fantasy 20th Anniversary Edition, it will be absolutely crucial for you to chat with the different townsfolk, as it's not just world building, but the townspeople will in fact tell you how to progress certain portions of the story. I say this here because I already knew that I needed to return back to the previous area near Cornelia to speak with Matoya in order to get the Jolt drink to wake the prince and proceed out to more of the overworld. However, this is only because I have played this game before. In Final Fantasy, you will need to take care in listening to what other NPCs have to say, because oftentimes, and we will discover this later on, once the world has opened up significantly more, that NPCs will tell us about important events or places that's required to move the story forward. Sure, if you already know where to go, then you're golden and can just head there, but without that knowledge, you will need to ask around. Thankfully, the NPCs are pretty spot on with what you need to do and how to accomplish whatever task is needed, so you won't find yourself lost for too long, I'd say. Maybe save for like later game stuff where you have to travel most of the world, but that's an entirely different animal, and again, even in those situations, with enough time and thought, you should be able to get through okay. With the Mystic Key in hand, after waking the prince with the Jolt drink, I head back to some previous areas and collect the treasures hidden behind all the locked doors up to this point. I mentioned this earlier, but again, the game really does expect you to travel back to other previously visited towns in-game. It's mostly effective in encouraging you to explore different options you may have missed out on before, like magic, equipment, etc. Here we find the nitro powder at Cornelia Castle, which is important for us to gain access to most of the world as well. I do say the game is mostly effective though in encouraging you to explore previous locations. This is because unless you had an acute awareness or even realized there were locked doors at Cornelia Castle, you could be spending a long time traveling to the few areas that you've already been to in the game thus far. To me, it's not really a deal breaker or anything, and despite appreciating the more open and fluid approach to storytelling here, it can come across as a bit obtuse by design, especially for the younger generations today, going back to a lot of these classics. Like I mentioned a bit earlier, towards the ending of the game, it does become a little bit harder, but it is still doable. I kind of harken this back, and I think about it in kind of the same way as going back to watching some classic films from like the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Certain filmmaking styles and or the handling of story progression can be a bit trickier to get invested in, since we have had a lot of changes in taste and style when it comes to film. But the more you stick with it, the more rewarding it can become, placing yourself back in the time when those films were released. Still, it is something worth noting if you're thinking about getting into any of these classic RPGs. From here, we give the nitro powder to the dwarves, and with a thunderous explosion, we now have access to the larger world. We draw one step closer to obtaining our first crystal. We've officially made it out of the inland and are free to travel to a lot more areas now. Luckily, we find a town just past a vortex named Melmund. Don't worry, I didn't forget about the optional dungeon here or the Earth Gift Shrine back near Cornelia. I will be talking about those a bit further into the adventure once we've collected a few of the crystals, but figured I'd at least mention them here as the vortex is pretty hard to miss after leaving Mount Drugar behind. Still, we arrive in Melmund and it's utterly destroyed looking, and the people here are mostly depressed and sad at their current state of living. In order to return Melmund back to its former glory, we are going to need to retrieve the Earth Crystal. Just as an aside, there is no item shop here, so I would recommend gathering items back in Elfenheim beforehand. You can always travel back, of course, if you need to restock, but it might behoove you to do so in advance. Still, we do a little bit of running back and forth in the meantime as we learn that in order to obtain the Earth Crystal, we're going to first have to get past a giant golem that's blocking it. In order to move the golem, we need to obtain the Star Ruby located inside the Cavern of Earth. However, one of the evil guardians of the Star Ruby is standing in our way, simply known as Vampire. Two things I noticed when going to review the footage of my game is that the Vampire in his pre-fight actually foreshadows the game's twist a bit here, talking about being unable to alter destiny and defeat the undead. In truth, it probably is just a foreshadow against the Lich boss, but I feel it does at least help to set up the inevitable quote-unquote destiny of the heroes and the final boss. Perhaps I'm reaching a bit, and although we aren't there yet and we are quite a bit from talking about anything final boss related, I do feel like the setup to the final boss is one of the weaker aspects in the game's narrative, when a lot of these fights could have set it up a bit more. However, we'll get to all that when we get there. The other quick thing I noticed, and something I think it's pretty funny, is that the vampire pronounces his W sounds with a V. So we can only assume this vampire comes from the lineage of vampires related to Bela Lugosi and the Count from Sesame Street.
Four beautiful beauts. I mean, four beautiful bats.
Taking out Vamp was straightforward, and after we obtain the Star Ruby, we are able to gain access to a Hermit Sage. He cues us in on the fact that the true culprit sealing away the Earth Crystal's power was past the vampire's den. So with the Sage's staff in hand, we head deeper into the cave to take on the first of the four fiends, Lich. The Four Fiends really are a staple of Final Fantasy, and a lot of what makes them special in the franchise as a whole can be seen here from the jump, each having their own affinity to a different element, to their significance in the plot of whatever game they are in. I like the idea that the Four Fiends are kind of like the shadow of the life-giving properties the four crystals are meant to emanate, showing that there can be darkness found in hope and vice versa. It's a simple but effective tool, and I think it works well in this game. We started the fight at level 23, which Lich themselves can hit pretty hard, especially since they have access to multiple target attacks like Blizzara. Still, keeping the pressure up, but more importantly the heals on, we take out Lich pretty fast. After the fight, we see the Earth Crystal become rejuvenated, and we also see access to the Earth Gift Shrine open up. That, again, we'll talk about a little bit later on. We are one crystal down now as we begin our march to collect the four remaining crystals. One of the nicer elements that I appreciated in the story was that after defeating the Lich and procuring the Earth Crystal is that traveling back to Melmon, we see that the grass has started to grow and that the planet itself is slowly healing. It's a small detail and only a few NPCs in town even acknowledged it, but you get the sense that the world is slowly healing, that the actions of the Warriors of Light do in fact hold some sort of weight to them. I mentioned this a bit earlier, but it reminds me of the moment after we defeated Astos, the Dark Elf. In a lot of ways, these little details and story elements / world building help to add a lot to the land and your progression to reclaim the crystals and destroy the Four Fiends, especially as we continue our journey forward and head to the Fire Crystal next. Although before we do, humorously, I noticed that the Earth Crystal in the menu is the second instead of the first lit up. It doesn't really change anything, but I was scratching my head as to why it wasn't just in the first slot from left to right. Again, no real significance, but I appreciated the quirky nature of the placement here. We instead turn our attention north as the Fire Crystal is also within our grasp. However, we stop off at the village of Crescent Lake. Again, like I mentioned earlier, this game is predicated on exploring and talking to NPCs, so in an average blind playthrough, it may take a bit of time to figure out what to do next. However, here at Crescent Lake, we find a bunch of sages standing in a circle. They give us more information on the world and lore as a whole, which I think is nice, but again, it does lead into the more obtuseness of the storytelling rather than having it naturally flow. A lot of these early JRPGs can also be like this for sure, but again, it's all about perspective and such. Luckily, one of the old men here conveniently has a spare canoe for us, so we are able to reach Mount Glug and gain access to the Fire Crystal. I do want to mention that in order to get the canoe like earlier, it would have been predicated on you chatting to the townsfolk in order to figure out where the mountain and the sages were at. So up to this point, I haven't mentioned the dungeons too much, and that's because for the most part, the dungeons have been pretty straightforward without too many gimmicks aside from needing to return with different items like the Sage's Staff. While that remains mostly true for this dungeon, here we also have to contend with lava floors in the area, which slowly whittle down your health over time as you step on the different lava panels. Typically, I'm not the biggest fan of environmental hazards in games, as I think it can kind of take away from the experience overall unless there's a purpose or gimmick involved with it. Sadly, it's really just used here as an inconvenience more than anything. I do appreciate the look and gimmick itself, and it does kind of change things up a bit. However, I don't think it really changes any way you approach the game or the dungeon itself. Compound this with the encounter rate, which I haven't even talked about yet, and the lava gimmick can start to become very tiresome very quickly. Still, it's not the worst here, I should say, and you're not going to get terribly lost or anything like that. Plus, it doesn't take too much damage away from you after stepping on the lava, but I do find it annoying, and I felt like I had to at least bring it up here, that there are some paths where you have no choice but to take a hit. If there was a gimmick to avoid fire or use alternate paths or even something like optional treasure chests off the beaten path in the fire, I'd say it would be much more understandable. However, despite it only being a minor inconvenience, it doesn't do much to elevate the dungeon in my eyes, since while it may change exploration slightly, it's not so much of a change where it breaks itself up from the dungeon crawling up to this point. Still, for what it's worth, the theming from the look and area to the enemies is on point, and despite the gimmick just kind of being a wash for me, I do appreciate that the look of this dungeon is significantly different from the other rock-based dungeons we've explored up to this point. Sure, it may just be fire, but it's enough visually to keep me interested in the area all the way to the second of the four fiends, Marileth. When starting this fight, I was level 28 at the time, and visually, I like the look of Marileth more so than Lich. Don't get me wrong, I thought Lich's undead necromancy look was okay, but I think I've enjoyed every other four fiend look from the other games in comparison. Marileth has this battle-hardened look for a Gorgon, and I think it works well for a creature that dwells inside the volcano. That sort of fiery battle-hardenedness goes well in a dungeon of lava and flame. Those 6 arms are not just for show either, as she can also hit like a truck. This is because dealing damage in Final Fantasy I is a bit different from other turn-based games in the franchise. This is because it's not a typical ATB system that later games would make popular. Instead, you choose all your character attacks ahead of time, and then you and your enemies will take turns attacking each other based on the moves selected and what your different speeds are. Once everyone on both sides has had the chance to have a turn, provided they didn't faint before their turn could go off, then you will have the ability to select another action. You've also probably noticed up to this point that we have spells like Haste, Slow, and Temper available. Temper will give you a strength buff, of course, but Haste and Slow also have to deal with damage as well, since the faster you are, the more quote-unquote hits you get in on a single turn, denoted by the hits represented on screen after attack. So simply put, the more hits and higher attack equals more damage. I didn't mention, but there are also defensive buffs like Blink and Protect, which are pretty self-explanatory, in that they buff agility and defense. Items themselves also have special properties outside of the typical potions and such. I didn't know this till closer to the end of the game, but if you look at your equipment in the items menu, you'll see that the equipment themselves cast abilities. At first I thought these would consume the items similar to the throw command in later games. Thankfully that doesn't happen, and instead it does what the item says it will, with its only limitation being you can only use a specific item the number of times as you have it in your inventory. So if one character uses an item and you do not have a spare, then you can't use it again. I also want to note that I don't know if a character's stats affect how potent each item's use is. If anyone watching knows, let me know in the comments below. This is just a high overview of the combat, and it's worth experimenting around with the different classes to see what build you want to go with. And with the 6 different classes and various magics available in-game, there is a lot of customization available. As far as Marileth is concerned, we kept the pressure on her and kept the heals up, so similar to Lich, she goes down and we gain access to the next secret dungeon and have released the fire crystal, putting us now a little bit below the halfway point of the story, as we get close to unlocking one of the more iconic things in the Final Fantasy series, allowing us to truly explore the remainder of the world. After clearing, well, let's face it, the fire temple, we are now heading to get the airship by finding the ice cavern. The cave is a little hidden, but once inside we start working our way through this dungeon. I don't mind it, but I did get a little bit turned around here. Honestly, there's not really much more to say with this one. I'm actually a fan of ice or snow themed areas, but this one didn't do that much for me, honestly. There is a bit of a gimmick where you have to drop down to various levels in order to find the right passage, and it's one of those that you'll figure it out on your first go through, but it'll be because you went down the wrong hole, forcing you to go back up to the top and go through the same one again. It's a bit tedious to get through, if I'm completely honest, and again, it's something different from the other dungeons, but it's one of those situations where you're going to spend so much time getting back to the correct hole that by the time you leave the dungeon, you're just going to be sort of ready to go, if that makes sense. Still, we grab the Levistone and head out, as the key to unlocking the airship is now in our grasp. From here, we board our ship and head towards the bottom right of the map to a small section of desert where our airship is being housed. Once we step into the area, we get a cutscene that I actually really like. It's fairly minimal, but watching the sands part to reveal the airship is one of those moments that just sticks out in my mind. It has that feel of something grand and majestic happen. When you see the sands part and that airship music start pounding, you get the sense that the characters and player themselves start to feel like anything is possible. It's a great moment and one I always look forward to in subsequent Final Fantasy games. Going through trials and tribulations up to the point that we gain access to the airship really is a treat in every Final Fantasy game. After acquiring the airship, the whole world is basically open to us. Sure, we will need to grab a couple items to get access to the 2 final crystals, but for the most part we have free range to do what we want and go wherever we want to. After stopping in Gaia on the northeastern side of the world to resupply and get access to new magic, I think it's time that we get our new classes instead of waiting till the end of the game. If this was your first time experiencing Final Fantasy I, especially blind, you will be able to upgrade your classes by locating Bahamut in the northwestern point of the world. Although it seems random, there are actually NPCs out there that hint at Bahamut being out there for you to find. Although it is entirely possible to play through the game without finding Bahamut and unlocking your new classes. This will actually lock you out of the really powerful magic in the game, and it's the reason why we haven't been able to purchase all the magic in the different towns up to this point. However, in order to gain access to the upgraded classes, we first head to the Citadel of Trials located near Gaia on the northeastern section of the world. We end up having to park our airship quite a bit away, but the walk is nice and we get a bit stronger. Once inside, we find an old man who gives us a bit more information on the Citadel, and we are on our way up. The trial can be a bit confusing, what with the different teleporters, but for the most part, you should be able to get your bearings fairly easily after you've gone through the teleporters a few times. Enemy-wise as well, it isn't anything super crazy either, so you shouldn't have too much trouble making it through the Citadel. I'd obviously recommend healing up beforehand, but you should know that there isn't a boss or anything like that here. In fact, the Citadel itself is completely optional, as there are other pieces of treasure in the Citadel, but the main prize is the rat tail, which we will use as an offering for Bahamut. Once you grab that, you can take the chair and head out of the Citadel. I actually really like the fact that in order to upgrade your classes, you need to conquer a secret dungeon. It just makes it all the more sweeter that once you've gained the key item you need, you'll be able to become even more powerful. Thematically, I think it works as well because it doesn't take anything away from the main journey. Instead, it adds to it by making the world feel bigger and quite a bit more mythical. After getting the rat tail, we head west to a bunch of different holes in these islands, which eventually leads us to Bahamut. Gaining the rat tail was the test to see if the heroes were in fact worthy of the upgrades. So our warrior has turned into a knight, thief into a ninja, white mage into a white wizard, and black mage into a black wizard. I love the look of the upgraded classes in this game. I think the warrior especially, as he looks the most like the warrior of light that's synonymous with the game itself. I also like the fact that each of the classes feel like extensions of the previous classes, albeit buffed up versions. Funny enough, the one that stands out the most to me is the ninja, since they are completely different, especially in terms of color and look. I don't mind the ninja being red, but I do wish design-wise it would have been closer to the thief's overall look, but it is what it is, I suppose. Still, on my way out, I decided to stop by the other holes surrounding Bahamut's cave to grab some of the treasures when I inadvertently entered the Hellfire Chasm. I thankfully saved before entering, but decided, what the hell, I would give the secret dungeon a go. These secret dungeons were also available in the GBA remake Dawn of Souls, but I don't remember playing through them at the time. It's possible I did, as I haven't played that in close to 20 years, so I'm looking at this as a semi-fresh experience. For this first dungeon, it's FF4 themed in its boss presentation, as the bosses are the 4 fiends from that specific game. Although the kicker is you need to complete the dungeon twice, as you can only fight bosses on floor 5 and 10. So once you complete the dungeon, if you want to clear the bosses, you'll need to go through it a second time. At least that's what I thought until my second playthrough. I realized that there were 2 4 fiends on both floors 5 and 10 just in separate locations. So I had to go in a third time just to fight the second fiend on floor 5, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself and I digress. The floors themselves, with the exception of 5 and 10, could all be different. They are randomly generated, but there are multiple different layouts with different treasures. So if you're looking to legitimately 100% this game, you'll need to play through this dungeon multiple times in order to find everything. I decided that I'd at least fight the 4 fiends from each run through. For the most part, each of the floors is straightforward, where you'll need to navigate a labyrinthian layout to find the stairs. Certain floors will have gimmicks like lava hurting you or crystals that, when stepped on, initiate a fight. The most interesting one, though, in my opinion, was the quote-unquote world map layout, where the objective is to find a palm tree which has the airship hidden underneath. Once you do that, you will be able to easily traverse the map and find the treasure or escape via the little sand dune thing we used to visit Bahamut. I appreciate the layout being a bit challenging, but it can get a little tiresome participating in fight after fight after fight, so just make sure you're ready for a trek if you partake in this. Still, first up was Cognazio, the water fiend, and for the most part, he wasn't too bad until he used his tsunami move. I attempted to keep all my party alive, but realized it was a losing battle. So I focused on healing up the warrior and white mage, but buffing the knight at the beginning with our black mage, and sure enough, Cognazio goes down fairly quickly. I do want to mention he only used tsunami twice in the fight, so at the beginning I had my warrior and ninja attacking while using the black mage to cast temper and haste on my 2 damage dealers. Rubicant was my second fight, and this one was a bit tougher and led to my first game over in Final Fantasy 20th Anniversary Edition. It took me 3 attempts to take Rubicant out, and essentially my strategy here was to use Null Fire with the black mage for the first move, then heal with potions and ethers as necessary to the white mage and other party members, but first tempering and hasting ninja and warrior. Meanwhile, I just had the white mage spam Hilara, and after a while Rubicant did eventually go down. The scariest part of the fight honestly was Rubicant using physical attacks, but I did notice he only used those sparingly. Same with the move Scorch. He mostly used Fyra and Fyraga, so I would always just account for those. After defeating him, we received a ribbon and the weapon Kichimoji before we headed back in for the second run. Keep in mind, if you die and did not save, you'll be kicked back to the entrance and will need to complete the whole dungeon again, so it would behoove you to save before taking on any of the 4 fiends. However, I do want to note that one of the better things about Final Fantasy 20th Anniversary Edition is that you do have the option to save anywhere, and you can save in the optional dungeons as well. However, I would probably recommend using separate save files just to be on the safe side. Next up, I took on Barbarica, and in a way she's a bit more difficult than Rubicant, albeit I only died once from her. What makes this fight difficult is that she has the ability called Ray, which turns you into stone. That throws a lot off in terms of approaching her with the strategy, as at any time you'll need to get your party members cured. What can help is obviously if you equip the ribbon ahead of time too. Despite what guides online tell you about it quote unquote rarely working, I don't know, for me it seemed like like every time she used the ability, it would work on my party members that didn't have a ribbon. Hence why I put the ribbon on my white mage just to be on the safe side. Although funny enough, in the fight I won, Ray was never thrown on my white mage. Still, my plan was to buff the ninja with temper and haste while using potions with the knight and black mage. And then I'd continue to spam Hilara with the white mage after casting Protectora at the beginning. My ninja was turned into stone a few times, which made me have to rebuff them, but after some work and a bit of luck, I was able to take her down. What can potentially make her nasty is that the cyclone attack deals a lot of damage to your party. Technically, I could have used a light curtain here, but I didn't think about it at the time. The other difficult part is Barbarica has a strong physical attack that would end up taking out a character pretty quickly after a cyclone use. Apparently, cyclone can also be used twice in a row, which would have completely decimated my party, but I guess in this situation, the RNG gods were on my side. After defeating the Wind Fiend, I received the Braveheart sword, and I ventured back one final time to take out the Earth Fiend. Scar Miglione is my favorite of the FF4 fiends, mostly because this fight takes place before the Cecil revelation in 4. I'm avoiding spoilers for now here, as I do plan on covering that game in the future since there was a PSP release. Still, I'm nostalgic as hell towards this guy. The fight itself is pretty cool as well. Sticking to the lore of 4, this is actually a two-phased fight, and he ended up taking me out on the first go-around in his second form. For his first form, as far as I know, he only uses Thunder, which, while hitting a lot, you can easily contend with utilizing healing. Afterwards, though, this is where the true challenge begins. His second form has a standard attack, which doesn't do a lot of damage. However, his ability Poison Gas hits like a freaking truck, and it could one-shot a character with low HP. Funny enough, I forgot to equip the Braveheart after the previous fight, so my knight wasn't swinging at full strength, and unfortunately, Scar did take me out with the Poison Gas attack. The child in me is pretending the attack was his flatulence, and him being a walking corpse could actually be the case. Still, on the second go-round, no luck. I'm stomped out again by the gas. Third time's a charm, and nope. And I also see Scar Miglione can use the gas multiple times in a row, which is completely devastating. So I play it safe since I'm already here, and I take out the Water Fiend for an extra light curtain before heading back, as the light curtain helped to keep my black mage alive last time, and it may be the ticket to beating this guy at my current level and skills. Unfortunately, after beating the Water Fiend again, I realized that, no, unfortunately, I was right on my first assumption. You can only fight one fiend at a time as the door locks behind you.
I'm an idiot!
So, reloading again, I stick with my initial strategy, and almost immediately my black mage is taken out. So I pop the two light curtains on the ninja and white mage, and mercifully, Scar basically uses mostly regular hits at the onset, giving me plenty of time to start stacking damage after the ninja casted haste on himself. The knight gets taken out eventually, but thankfully the ninja and white mage are enough to put this guy away, and I can finally leave the optional dungeon by the way of the 5th floor dungeon exit portal. Because in these optional dungeons, once you reach one of the floor bosses, they do give you the option of leaving early if you choose to do so. All in all, these fights were pretty cool and were a significant challenge. In hindsight, I absolutely should have saved this for closer to the end game, but the challenge did make this a fun distraction for the main story. Plus, I'm all for anything FF4 related, so for me, this worked. In truth, these dungeons aren't too bad, and the boss fights are challenging in the Hellfire Chasm, but there is one thing I actively hate in this optional dungeon, and it's probably the worst thing in the entire game in my opinion. It's the Crystal Cave variation with the people walking around. This section is so annoying for all the wrong reasons. The least annoying thing first is that encounters are relegated to diamonds on the ground. Mercifully, these are the only way to get into a fight on these type of floors, as there is no random encounters. However, maneuvering to get a treasure or to get to the exit will oftentimes require you to step on these diamonds. To be fair, the fights aren't really hard, they just feel like they're wasting your time when you could be just moving forward. But no, the most egregious thing are these damn NPCs. Watch here on my third run. Just trying to get to the next area, I need to step in front of this wizard, but I only get one small window of opportunity to do so. Oftentimes, I either miss my chance to walk or overstep entirely, requiring me to wait for this slow NPC to make his way back for another shot. This is compounded even more later on during these sections, as there could be a diamond section nearby. So if you're not careful, you'll accidentally trip a fight, requiring you to finish that just for another crack at getting by an NPC. It's so tedious and annoying that I think someone on the dev team actively put this in here as a joke, and you know, hats off to them because it is absolutely the worst damn thing in this game in my opinion.
This sucks.
This annoyance aside, if you understand how to fight the 4 fiends and your aim is to clear this dungeon once, it should take you roughly 40 minutes to an hour to get through, not counting potential resets in if a fiend takes you out. I still say it's worth going through these dungeons even if you have to slog your way through these diamond sections just for the chance to fight the 4 fiends. After conquering the chasm, I decided that I'd take another quick detour and venture into the Earth Gift Shrine, since that opened up before the chasm, so logically I figured it might be a little less difficult. In terms of enemies, yes. Bosses, however, were a bit trickier. Now this dungeon's only 5 floors. The first 4 appear in random order, but to the best of my understanding they all have the same layout, and just being completely honest, the first map I walked into was the desert, so I decided to look up and see if there was a map online, and thankfully there was for every single floor out there. Normally I at least try to get through these without the use of maps or anything first, but after the chasm, simply put, I was like, no, just no. Still, the dungeons aren't too bad in terms of the enemy encounter difficulty, although I read you can fight an abyss worm in the desert, but I never ran into one during the 4 separate runs through the Earth Gift Shrine. As, yes, after defeating a boss on the 5th floor, you have to fight your way through the whole dungeon for another crack at the bosses.
What? You have got to be kidding me!
Yeah, it took a little bit of time, to say the least. My first attempt was going up against Cerberus, who has 2 attacks. A standard attack, which does negligible damage at best, and Thunderstorm, which basically completely obliterates my team. And he can also use this more than once in a row as well. After 2 attempts, I can't beat him, so I swap over to Echidna, who again has 2 moves. A physical attack, which is negligible, and Earthquake. Thankfully, Earthquake never touched my party, so after buffing my damage dealers, I was able to take Echidna out very quickly. Afterwards, I headed back over to Onrak to get a more powerful healing spell before heading back. I guess this is a saving grace with these dungeons in that you are able to leave and go resupply for further runs in the game. Preferentially, I would have liked to have muscled through all 4 bosses on a single run, but it is what it is. I didn't mention this before, but I'm assuming you probably figured it out, but if you re-enter a dungeon, you can also farm these bosses by fighting them again. Still, the Earth Gift Shrine was a lot more forgiving than the Hellfire Chasm, and that makes sense since it was the first of the extra dungeons unlocked. The only area I actively disliked was the forest, as it's a bit of a maze, and I thought it was annoying you'd have to stop and fight a lot of enemies blocking the way. I guess they wanted to add to the difficulty, but the enemies here are weak as hell, so it just became tedious and boring every time I'd get back to the forest in any of my runs. Still, if you're going in blind, these wouldn't be the hardest mazes to get through, as I could see you being able to get your bearings very quickly on subsequent visits to the forest, plus the layouts for the rooms themselves do not change, so I guess that's a plus. Circling back though, I do want to stress the tedium of these dungeons a bit more though, as I don't think I've really touched on how boring and tedious these can be. Legitimately, I'd been looking for an excuse to watch the Frasier reboot since it first launched on Paramount+, and these enemies were so easy that most of the time I was just holding the X button to attack the mobs since the damage dealt was so minimal. And the few times I'd need to whip out a black mage spell, it was only to take out mobs with multiple enemies faster. I bring up the Frasier reboot because more than half of the time on these runs I was watching the sitcom, and I legitimately got through about half of the first season, which is only 10 episodes, by just kind of casually looking down to maneuver a bit more in the dungeon before an encounter, especially in the forest area where you have to fight set enemies and still get random encounters.
Ah, yes, nothing says independence like condescending busy work.
I can appreciate the extra dungeons being added for sure, but up to this point, extra bosses are the only reason I muscled through these, as it was cool seeing bosses from past games in Final Fantasy I Anniversary Edition. And not to rush through the other 3 boss fights, so I do want to pay equal amount of time, it's just that these boss fights ended up being about the same in terms of gameplay once I ran through the dungeons a second, third, or fourth time, because as I would run through, I would level up significantly. So in the fights with Two-Headed Dragon, Ari Man, and then eventually going back to fight the Cerberus, I was able to take them out by obviously buffing my characters, getting the heals going, and just slowly slogging at the enemies. Again, not the worst thing, but with these bosses, they can be tricky to go through, but most of the time, just by leveling up a bit, you will be able to get through them. Still, the big thing that bothered me, especially with the Earthgift Shrine, was just the repetitive nature of having to go through this dungeon 4 separate times in order to fight everybody. It gets to the point where you're almost like not wanting to do it, but at the same time, you've already invested so much time that you might as well see it all the way through. Anyway, rants aside, after completing the Earthgift Shrine, it was time to continue our adventures, seeing as we don't have access yet to the other 2 extra dungeons. Right about now, we are halfway through the main story, so next it's time to go after the water crystal. So we head to the northwest side of the world near the city of Onrock and seek out a caravan in the desert. We buy the ferry for sale, which is a whopping 40,000 gils, so luckily we spent some time on those extra dungeons. After releasing the ferry on the other side of the world in Gaia, we now have the ability to go underwater, but we set ourselves up to get the final crystal as well by grabbing the warp cube in a secret waterfall near Onrock. Once the prep work was done, we unlocked the submarine after talking to a few people in Onrock and head underwater to save mermaids and get the water crystal. I don't mind this section, but it does feel a bit roundabout by going from one corner of the world to the next in order to accomplish this. Still, if I put my mind back to the late 80s and early 90s, when this game came out, I can see people figuring this stuff out as there was a lot less things vying for their time and attention, allowing the player to fully appreciate exploring the world. I don't think it's bad, but like a lot with the exploration in this game, you do need to know what you're expecting going in. Despite the fact that if you do talk to the NPCs in this game, they will for the most part lead you in the right direction. After going through the previous optional dungeons, the Sunken City felt like a cakewalk for the most part. Very rarely did I have to whip out magic on normal mobs, and that was primarily because it would end the battle faster. Still, I do think that this shows one of the biggest issues with the non-NES versions of the game, in that it's very easy once you get to a certain level. Sure, some bosses will give you trouble, but the only time I've felt actively in danger was going up against some of the optional bosses. Regular fights pose little to no challenge, which can start to drain on you, especially because it also exacerbates one of the biggest issues with this version of FF1, in that the encounter rate is absolutely astronomically ridiculous at times. The game features encounter traps where going to a certain area can lead you into getting into fights over and over without any clear indication, like the crystals in the optional dungeon. And while this isn't nearly as bad as the trap rooms from FF2 in my opinion, it can still be very annoying. However, this still doesn't account for how insane the encounter rate in this game still is. Often you'll get 1 to 2 steps in and another encounter will pop, and this is consistent through to the end of the game. Sure, it could just be my luck of course, and it wasn't like this the whole game, especially on the world map, although it would happen there too. It still happened enough to where I noticed just how bad the encounter rate is in this one. I'm hoping that 2 and 4's encounter rates are severely toned down, but we shall see. It just makes me glad I chose to play this one any way I could, as it gave me a chance to kick back and read my book. Highly recommend to play this way, but it can still be just as comfy and productive if you're playing on handheld as well. Anyway, we get the Rosetta Stone and head to the bottom floor to take on the boss and secure the water crystal. Kraken went down very fast. I buffed the Knight and Ninja and spammed Thundaga once the buffs were in place, and Kraken went down in about 3 or 4 turns. So after we reveal the water grotto opening for the optional dungeon, it's time to head out for the final crystal. Before we head to the final crystal, we make a quick detour to Melmund to use the Rosetta Stone on Uni, here in order to learn the language of Lufinian. What a guy. I didn't even know what a Lufinian was, but apparently it's something I should have already known about. Jokes aside, this is how we get some of the strongest magic in the game that'll essentially make the rest of the game a breeze. After that, we head to the Mirage Tower after picking up the chime from Lufinzians. Again, a lot lot of this stuff will be explained by the NPCs via their dialogue, so if you're worried about a lack of directions, I will say for the most part the game does a good job pointing you generally where to go. With the chime, we are granted access to the Mirage Tower. Once we climb the 3 floors, we run into a teleporter where the cube we picked up from the previous Robo will come in handy, granting us access to the Sky Fortress. And this was back underneath the waterfall. On the 2nd floor, we find the Adamantite, which will be used later on, before we continue our trek through the fortress, laying waste to the enemies as we climb floor after floor, again with the encounter rate really punching up our playtime here before we get to the 5th floor. Now, normally we would just go straight for Tiamat to finish this dungeon. However, we are also going to be hunting Warmech. If you don't know, Warmech is a secret super-ish boss in this game. It's technically both labeled and not labeled one. However, I would consider Warmech an early version of a super boss. Still, Warmech has a super low encounter rate here, which is a 1 in 64th chance of appearing. Even worse so, Warmech's only spawn point is this narrow bridge right before Tiamat. So I set up a save point and begin walking back and forth for a while. For a long while. For a very long while. You can see I fast forwarded the footage here because it did take quite a bit of time. All in all, it took 34 minutes to find Warmech, which to be fair is better than some other times that I've heard online from other people just trying to encounter this guy. And as a side note, no, I was not able to finish reading off Battle Royale waiting for this fight, but I did read a decent chunk of it while waiting, which if you are curious, loving it so far by the way if you're interested. And if you like the movie, you should absolutely give the novel a shot, because so far I think it's pretty good. Violent, but very good, but still, I digress. Fortunately, I even got a preemptive strike on Warmech, so I was sitting nicely to begin with. Warmech has 2 moves, a normal attack and nuke. Both can be devastating if you're underprepared and underbuffed. So to start, I cast Haste and Temper on the Knight and Ninja, while using my White Mage to cast Protera on everyone. Warmech also heals 100 HP in between turns, so luckily once I got my buffs up, I was dealing significant damage, including using Flare with the Black Wizard. In truth, my biggest fear was that Warmech would run from the fight, as it does have that chance to do so. Thankfully, this does not happen, and I take down the OG super boss in a few turns. With that out of the way, it's time to take on Tiamat. Playing it safe, employing the same strategy I used against Warmech, and my team utterly decimates Tiamat in a few turns. So with that, we have acquired all the crystals now, which all that stands in our way of victory, and the credits is the final chaos. However, before we head to the finale, we have 2 bonus dungeons just begging to be played through. So we head back down to resupply before heading on to the 3rd of the optional dungeons, the Lifespring Grotto. This dungeon was Final Fantasy V themed, and at first I wasn't really feeling it as the labyrinthian design made me groan a bit at first. However, once I got to the first boss on floor 5 and realized this was Final Fantasy V themed, my mindset changed when we fought the main man himself, Gilgamesh. The fight itself isn't too crazy, but it's always welcome to hear Clash on the big bridge in any Final Fantasy game. Still, I think the dungeon got better after this point. There are areas that aren't specifically set up as labyrinths to put you into fights. Instead, there's a breakup in the monotony where you have to maneuver around dancing girls and walk along fading platforms as an example. It's nothing extravagantly different, but breaking up the gameplay here was nice, and it was my favorite of these extra dungeons so far. Even some of the enemies, like killer sharks and dragons, were somewhat of a challenge here, and mercifully you don't have to complete this dungeon multiple times to fight all the special bosses, as this dungeon is 20 floors and all are decent in length. One final note before I talk about the bosses, but there are some cool references here to Final Fantasy IX here that I appreciated. I'm not sure if there are more, but the few I did find made me smile for what it's worth. As for the bosses, I already mentioned Gilgamesh, who in my opinion was the right kind of Gilgamesh here. He wasn't difficult and played up mostly for laughs, and I didn't have really any problems on the 5th floor taking him on. On the 10th floor, I fought Atomos, who also wasn't too difficult with my usual buff heal strategy working fine. I made sure to also pop on Null Death just in case, as I'm pretty sure his vacuum type attack is an insta-KO move, but it never once took me out, thankfully. However, Upon reaching the 20th floor, I came to the discovery that I was in fact wrong again. There are 2 bosses, and in order to fight them, I'd need to replay the whole dungeon again just for a shot at both bosses. I'll be honest, I let out the largest sigh so far playing this game. Yes, these are optional dungeons, and I get the concept they were going for with giving the player more reasons to keep coming back, but I feel it was executed poorly, as once you're finished, especially with these longer ones, you really don't want to go back in. So for the final optional dungeon, I'm just going to expect the worst when going in. On a positive note, I do want to commend all the folks on GameFAQs and other sites who had the commitment to replay these dungeons over and over and over again in order to determine all the drops and layouts for these optional dungeons. That must have taken an insane amount of time, and my hat goes off to them for their dedication and service. Before we head back on the second loop, we need to take out Shinryu, which was one of the super bosses in 5, which I thought was really cool they added them in here. This was the toughest fight thus far, but we were able to triumph over Shinryu without taking a loss. We kept the buffs up the whole match and used our white mage for heals. When things started getting a little dicey, I'd have the knight and / black mage heal with high potions or the healing helm. At points, I would even have them throw ethers on the white mage to keep the heal spams going. After a while though, Shinryu does eventually go down, and we get the Ragnarok, which in terms of power dwarfs anything else in the game so far, before we head back in for the second loop. Mercifully, it looks as though the rooms aren't different, but the placement order can be. Upon making it back to the 5th floor, we find Gilgamesh is no longer where we fought him last time. Instead, he's near the teleporter out of the dungeon. I wasn't expecting any sort of changes or follow-up plot-wise, but it's Gilgamesh, so I think it's great they honored the tradition of having him be a bit more enigmatic. As far as the fight with Gilgamesh goes, it's the exact same one as before, same with the Atamos fight. So, moving on, remember when I said Shinryu was the hardest boss in the game thus far?
That's right, Major, you did!
I lied.
Omega is definitely the toughest boss thus far, and took me the longest to whittle them down. Essentially, my 2 physical damage dealers were useless in this fight, aside from taking some physical attack damage from Omega, which would instantly kill my ninja if he wasn't blocking. Omega would use 3 moves: regular attack, earthquake, which thankfully almost always missed, and wave cannon, which hit everyone. Like I mentioned, my physical damage dealers were rendered basically useless, so I had to rely on my black mage for damage, and essentially just had him spam flare and Thundaga for 500-ish damage. This took a long while, and after I finally beat Omega, I went back and looked at how much health they actually had via the bestiary, and you can see that, yeah, it would take a long time to beat this thing, only doing 500 damage. I even needed to utilize a bunch of ethers and mega elixirs because the issue became that I was running out of NP constantly. Very scary fight if you're underprepared, and apparently I was going in. I imagine there is an easier way to do this fight that I just wasn't aware of at the time, so if you do know of a faster way, let me know in the comments below. I also didn't realize the extent of buffing, but I'll get to that a little bit later on. I will say, mercifully, Omega wouldn't generally target my mages with its devastating physical attack too often. The black mage took a couple of hits in the beginning, but was mostly ignored. However, towards the end of the fight, Omega did take out my white mage, and it was scary because Omega actually took my white mage out entirely, and I wasn't sure I'd have enough turns to re-raise them and keep the heal spam going. Thankfully, right after re-raising my white mage, the fight was over, and I obtained the Masamune. To be real, I actually liked this dungeon a lot. However, it would have been more satisfying to go through it once, but I guess that could be said for all of these extra dungeons. With the Lifespring Grotto out of the way, it's time to head to the Whisperwind Cove and the final of these extra chaos dungeons. And it's the longest one yet, spanning 40 floors and being based on arguably one of the best Final Fantasies of all time. For the bosses, Final Fantasy VI. I do want to mention, as a quick side note, that I finally figured out what button combo brought up the world map. You hold circle and press select. So, I'm not kidding, this whole time I was relying on memory and online maps. I do wish that there was some sort of in-game options that tell you this, because I imagine the manual for the game would as well. but at the same time, we're so close to the end of the game now that I guess it doesn't really matter anymore. Still, the world map itself is iconic in its own right, and I think logically a lot of it works, so I didn't find myself getting too lost and needing to resort to an online map that often or anything. Although, to be fair, they could have just had the map pop up by pressing one button instead of holding one and pressing another, because it is kind of funny, there's quite a few different buttons that are not used in the game. Instead, they have us do this almost cheat code-like button press combination to open the map, but I digress as we enter the Whispering Cove and tackle the final Chaos Dungeon. Again, same as before, the order here is always different, so I'll stick with some highlights. I appreciate in the dungeons here anytime there is a variety, so I like that there was stuff like a trading quest with the dwarves and even a floor full of mages where you can pick up magic of all levels, just in case you may have missed it prior in the game. There's even a room where you need to tend to a man's crazy and loose beaver. Get your mind out of the gutter. It's a reference to FF2, and you'll help this man arrange his beaver by sectioning some right and left. It's a simple distraction, but again, I appreciate the FF2 reference. Still, our first boss is on floor 10, and it's against Typhoon, who, I'll be honest, isn't too difficult. He has two moves in Sneeze and his normal attack. Sneeze is a one-hit KO, and during the fight, he managed to take out my Knight and Ninja once each. However, attempts after that were all failures to connect, as I'm assuming there is a lower hit chance. For the remainder of the fight, Typhoon only used physical attacks, so I buffed the party per usual, adding Invisible into the mix just to be on the safe side to raise the party's evasion, and Typhoon went down pretty easily. Even if Sneeze worked every time, I still think the fight would have been more than manageable here. Next up was Orthos, aka Ultros, the main man himself, and this was probably the easiest fight out of all the extra bosses in all the Chaos Dungeons thus far. He once again does two moves, a physical attack, which to be fair does hit sort of decent, and a move called Ink, which missed my party every single time. Still, to be fair, I buffed my party and took everyone's favorite octopus, or is it squid, out before continuing the trek forward. Our third boss was the Phantom Train, and at the risk of sounding like I'm repeating myself, I used the same tactics here as I did before, and the Phantom Train only used a physical attack and Acid Rain, which damaged the whole party. Simple enough fight, albeit I guess technically slightly harder than Ultros. On to the main event though, as we take on the final boss of the Whispering Cove in Doomgaze, who was pretty easy overall once you get your buffs and healing rhythm going. He will occasionally use the death spell on us, but thankfully it never amounted to anything. Out of all the Chaos Dungeons, thematically, this was my favorite. The whole dungeon seemed to be based around the afterlife, or at least that was my impression I got. Each floor that had a puzzle was based on how our party dealt with the afterlife. The hazy town only filled with children who can't quite figure out how they got there, but are still enveloped in their childhood securities. The town corrupted by the Phantom Train, which in a way feels like a sort of hell till you purify the area. Even the floor with lost souls of previous enemies make an appearance here. The enemies themselves also are death themes in certain circumstances as you face off against death manticores and reapers. Even if I was to stretch it to the beavers and dwarves as well, with them not being able to pass on because their business is unfinished until the Warriors of Light arrive to help sort out the troubled souls, similar to how Astos and the vampire finally pass on after we defeat them again in one of the floors. Despite being the longest dungeon and the absurd encounter rate, this actually ended up being the best one, as I felt it stimulated by the extra mile they went here to make this one feel special. It gave me that quote-unquote I kinda want to see more feel to it, and while I would have preferred it to be a bit shorter in my opinion, the 40 floors at the very least still felt like they had purpose. It even helps to flesh out extra characters like the aforementioned vampire and Astos, not to mention the bottle fairy from the caravan earlier. In a way, this dungeon actually sees the ending of a couple plot points from the original story that really don't get tied up. It's nothing groundbreaking or anything like that, but I felt it was a nice detail and made the world of FF1 feel bigger and more defined. The whole concept here was cool, and despite it being an optional dungeon, it felt like it had some sort of story, with each boss also in a way adding something to that motif. It's something I think would be cool to dive a bit deeper on and make more connections, but that won't be here today. Maybe I'll do a follow-up someday just dissecting this dungeon, or rather the main storied floors a bit more. Let me know if that's something that you'd all like to see here on this channel, or maybe a pub lore channel, or I don't know, something like that. I'm open to the idea and maybe even diving deeper into other games lore, but as always, Say it with me, I digress. And pray you're not playing any sort of drinking game with how many times I've digressed in this review, as you may find yourself an unintentional passenger of the Phantom Train. I think out of all the dungeons though, the Lifespring Grotto had the hardest bosses in Omega and Shinryu. That could have been because of the level I was or the equipment in use, but they were definitely the most challenging of the bosses. Still, these can be a bit grindy and the very definition of extra dungeons, but I do appreciate their inclusion here, and I feel their absence in the Pixel Remaster was a mistake. Despite having my own grievances with these extra dungeons, having them is definitely better than not having them. Granted, I understand the Pixel Remasters are just enhanced versions of the original games. I still would have liked to have seen these in. It'd be like getting a Persona 3 remake and not including Katone and the answer right away in the package to... oh, wait. Anyway. So, all 4 of the Chaos Dungeons were originally derived from the GBA remake Dawn of Souls. However, there is still one extra dungeon left that we will discuss after we head to the endgame and finish the main campaign off, once and for all. So, to initiate the end of the game, we need to go back to the very beginning. We are heading back to the Chaos Shrine. Suffice it to say, the final dungeon was mostly a cakewalk, especially after going through the 2 previous Chaos Dungeons. Not just in terms of enemies, but in the dungeon design. This was significantly shorter, and with all the best gear in the game, the enemies were essentially just inconveniences as I make my way to the final boss. Still, I do think the endgame areas leading up to the final boss are pretty cool and definitely sets the tone for other Final Fantasy games in the future. FF1 wasn't the first game to do the whole final dungeon motif, but they've always gone out of their way to make the final moments in their games memorable and the last few hours epic. The music alone sells it for me as something special. It really has that quote-unquote the stakes are real feel to it, if that you know what I mean, and I love it. Now, the dungeon itself can be a bit confusing on your first go around, but even just wandering around, you should make your way through eventually. Albeit, this is one of those dungeons where I do appreciate the Pixel Remaster a bit more since there is a map available at all times to look at. Still, I do really like the fact that the loot we get at the beginning of the game is finally utilized here and that it plays the Final Fantasy theme. It's a really nice touch. Before we can fight the final boss, we take on the 4 fiends again. With our current loadout, they couldn't do too much to stop our onslaught to the end of the game. Lich went down a few turns with no buffs, as did Marleth, albeit I did need to heal at least once during the fight. The other 2 fights went about the same as well with the other 2 fiends. Kraken was pretty straightforward, and while Tiamat took more damage than the formers, they still went down pretty quick like the others. Just as an FYI, with this version of the game, there is no indicator on the map where the 4 fiends are located. It looks as though it's a random encounter, but the tiles you step on are what initiate the fight. Unlike other versions of the game, like the Pixel Remaster, you have an orb that you must engage with to start the fight. With the way this game is programmed though, if you walk over the top section again after leaving and coming back to the room, you'll reactivate the boss fight. I don't recommend doing this. Not because the bosses are challenging, but because they do take significantly more damage than other enemies, and you net extremely low XP and only 1 gil. If you are looking to grind, you're better off fighting virtually anyone else in the dungeon. So traversing through, you make it to the final boss of the game, and it turns out that it's Garland, the evil knight and first boss of the game, is the final and last obstacle between us and the ending credits. It turns out the 4 fiends from the past saved him in the future when we defeated him. Therefore, Garland was able to send them into the future to create a time paradox of sorts. The only way to stop it is to defeat Garland's new form, the embodiment of chaos. Chaos has quite a few heavy hits for sure, but in comparison to Omega and Shinryu, it's like night and day, so buffing and healing like those fights allowed me to whittle Chaos down pretty quickly. Everything Chaos is going to throw at you here is 100% manageable, and as long as you get your buffs up early enough, you shouldn't have any issues dealing with Chaos. I will say though, I love the arena here as it really offers that big fight feel on the edge between two dimensions. The look here is not only visually appealing, but symbolically it works great with the whole time distortion aspects of the story. Chaos itself also looks cool too with the whole demonic look going on. I'll admit, he isn't my favorite looking of the final bosses from Final Fantasy, but for what he is, and being the very first, he does a great job setting the tone for the rest of the series. After pummeling him with our best hits and spells, we bring an end to Chaos as Final Fantasy I comes to a conclusion. Final Fantasy I's ending does an okay job here, attempting to tie up the whole time loop story. It is kind of funny in a roundabout way because at the onset of the story to Final Fantasy I, it's fairly simple and straightforward. Save the princess and ultimately go on a quest to find the crystals and save the world. Only to find out there was this whole time loop situation that fed into the main beats of the game. Back in the late 80s when this game released, I imagine this sort of twist melted a lot of people's minds. Plus, this is something Final Fantasy is kind of known for with the complex narrative and having elements of sci-fi fiction or multi-layered concepts involved in their plots and endings. I do have to be honest though, I really don't like the ending here personally. I can see a lot of people appreciating it, and I see where it has its place in Final Fantasy history. To me though, I think this ending is needlessly complicated, and the explanation played at the end here feels like an entire dissertation to try and make sense of the time loop story. It's like when you're online reading a fan theory as to why a certain character didn't die because of XYZ, and you're just kind of sitting there like, wait, what the heck are you even going on about? Or me around 2 a.m. after too many shots of El Cazadores connecting dots about the government and Bigfoot, but I digress. I feel like a better ending would have just been Garland didn't die, he made a pact with the fiends, became chaos, and now wants to destroy the world. It's simple, yeah, but it does get the point across. Now, Final Fantasy is one of my favorite, if not my favorite game series, and I like most things about this game, but the ending also just seemed to rush, and having a twist for the sake of having a twist. It doesn't work for me, but of course, that's just my opinion. And again, despite Final Fantasy being one of my favorite franchises, that to me doesn't mean that it's above any sort of critiques or ways that it could be better. Still, for what it's worth, this did set the foundation for later twists and grandiose universe shatterings for later games in the franchise, and despite myself not being the biggest fan of the ending, I know without it we wouldn't have other great moments in Final Fantasy history. Final Fantasy is one of my favorite video game series of all time, and even though the ending here isn't my thing, I will always respect them for at least taking a swing on something that's either gonna work fantastically or completely blow up in their face. In a funny way, it's kind of a hallmark of Square in general that I've grown to appreciate and often loathe throughout the years of fandom. But it's Final Fantasy, and you know, no matter what the game's gonna turn out like, you'll definitely have something to talk about. I'm glad I got to play through this and highly recommend any others who have not had the chance to play through this story to do so, even if the ending wasn't particularly for me. With the 4 optional Chaos dungeons I completed for Final Fantasy 20th Anniversary Edition, my total time came out to 23 hours and 15 minutes for total playtime, which isn't too bad. With the Chaos dungeons though, I imagine that time would have been cut in half. I was also able to complete 89% of the bestiary and 77% of the art gallery, which I'll touch on a bit once I finish wrapping up the story. However, there was something that I did only slightly mention earlier, as we aren't quite done here yet. After completing the 4 previous Chaos dungeons, we were actually treated to a cutscene with a robed figure who grants access to the Labyrinth of Time in the Chaos Shrine. So yes, there is actually 1 more dungeon left and 1 more boss left to conquer. Well, technically 8, but I'll explain. The The Labyrinth of Time is the final obstacle in the game, and it's different than everything thus far. It's set up where you need to traverse 8 floors, but there's an opportunity to traverse one of 35 different floors. The kicker is you won't simply be traversing the floors to find an exit. Rather, each floor has a puzzle you must solve. Everything from guessing the correct number of bats in a room to following a light. There's actually quite a bit of variety with the puzzles here, and it's something I can appreciate as it keeps things fresh, especially this late in the game. It would have been easy just to create another long, winding labyrinth-like dungeon, so I do think it's cool they tried something different, and I think this idea on its own is a success. However, there is an extra catch to this. You are timed for each floor, so you aren't given all day to complete this. However, you can accrue more time beforehand by sacrificing gameplay mechanics in the room prior. So, for example, you can disable your sprinting and white magic to get more time on the floor. You won't be able to sprint or heal using magic, but you'll have more time to complete. This resets once you complete the floor, and the cycle repeats for the 8 floors leading to the super boss, which I will talk about in a moment. Now, I don't necessarily think this is a good or bad thing, but it definitely adds an additional layer of challenge to this dungeon. Risking what to sacrifice in order to increase your time while gambling which puzzles you might be solving is pretty exhilarating the first time you're running through this. Now, I do want to forewarn you that this dungeon is tough. You will have to contend with multiple handicaps, and the enemies here, despite being easier in the main game, are now harder when you're stuck in situations with less options. Not to mention there is no saving, and losing your entire party at any moment is a game over, meaning you don't even just get booted out of the dungeon, you're taken to the title screen. Still, I do think it's doable even on a first go, just be prepared when you head in. As for the ultimate boss in the game, this is where things get interesting. Final Fantasy 20th Anniversary Super Boss is named Cronodia, and they are tough, easily dwarfing Shinryu and Omega in terms of difficulty. On my first attempt, I spent 30 minutes hacking at the boss, and unfortunately it would end up being to no avail. This was actually the only boss in game I needed to look up a strategy for, as I didn't want to get all the way up to the top again just to get stomped out, as despite surviving a long time, it felt consistently like a losing effort. That's when I discovered that you could actually stack buffs in the game. This was something I did not know, nor did I experiment with prior, so that one's on me, unfortunately. And had I known that, I think that would have made a lot of the super bosses quite a bit easier to contend with. I also discovered the gimmick with the dungeon. Each floor you clear will determine how much stronger or weaker Cronodia will be. The more blue seals you release, the stronger Cronodia becomes, and lucky for me, I found this out after releasing all blue seals. Yay! To be fair, I'd rather take on the strongest version of this boss anyway. I'm guessing the seals will vary based on how quickly you clear each floor, since the more handicaps you give yourself, the longer time you get on the floor. I think it could also be whether or not you finish before the allotted time ends, but I never found a situation where I ran out of time. The dungeon here is set up for you to run through it 8 times in order to collect all the equipment Cronodia has to offer, which, by the way, is not something I'm planning on doing, but I do think it's interesting overall, and that's what I mean by 8 different final bosses. It's essentially just 8 different variations of Cronodia. Still, getting back to Cronodia, she uses a wide variety of attacks relating to the 4 fiends, as well as stuff like warp and a gnarly regular attack if you have no or minimal buffs active. The biggest game changer making this fight hard though is the seal ability, which locks out an option for 4 turns, rendering either regular attacks, magic, or items unusable till the status is removed after the 4th turn. Without buffs on, this can make things very, very scary very quickly, as Cronodia on their own can one-shot both mages with physical attacks. Compound this with the gas attack ability, and you can see just how scary this super boss can actually be. With buffs though, this fight can still be a little tricky, as Cronodia can just decide to destroy you right away with physical attacks or strong magics. Your saving grace is that when they use seal, at least for me, they sealed with fight first, allowing me to keep buffing my characters and get them healed up. I also raised all my characters' health to as close to 999 as I could. From thereafter, I buffed my defense with Protectora and the White Cape for Invisera, as well as Blinks and Defender. I began buffing strength on Knight and Ninja while using Flare with Black Mage, and thankfully this was enough to keep Cronodia at bay. From there I kept the heals up, and eventually I was able to take out Cronodia and acquire the Barbarian Sword. After the boss fight, I received my stats for the dungeon's completion, and I thought that was pretty cool. What rank did you receive after completing this dungeon? dungeon. Still, with everything completed, at least to my liking on the story, I had one last thing I wanted to do before ending my playthrough. That being to create Excalibur, something I totally forgot to do during my playthrough. So with Excalibur created, I head back to Cornelia and save my game one final time to end Final Fantasy I's story. As far as extras, there are a couple things we can look at here once we've completed the game once. Pretty standard amongst most Final Fantasy games nowadays, but we have the bestiary, which shows all the enemies you have fought and defeated throughout your playthrough, showing the enemy's health, gil, and item drops as well. Pretty standard stuff here, but I always appreciated having these in RPGs, as I oftentimes feel compelled to try and complete the whole bestiary at least once in an RPG, especially a Final Fantasy game. We also get access to concept art, and I'll be honest, I could look at artwork by Yoshitaka Amano all day, and I actually have a few art books of this that I still browse at from time to time and highly recommend them. The look and feel of Final Fantasy is always one of the things that draws me into the many worlds of the franchise, and really any excuse to look at Amano's artwork is all I ever need. The second to last in the extras is the music player, and at the time, having this would have been awesome. I think today we take for granted stuff like Spotify and even YouTube to an extent when it comes to having whatever it is we want to listen to at our fingertips, and to be honest, that's also not a bad thing. I think it's awesome how far technology has come, and that nowadays it's more easier than ever to almost instantaneously consume whatever you want. Despite the music player probably not really going to be something people go after to utilize as a feature nowadays, the music remasters and remakes here are nothing short of epic. Truly, one of the things that stands out in these remakes are how high quality and great almost every single one of these tracks are. Sure, I love the classics, but these remakes are absolutely spectacular. Like the original game, Final Fantasy 20th Anniversary Edition does feature the hidden minigame that I'm absolutely terrible at. To access the minigame, you'll want to be on your ship, hold the X button, and then proceed to press the circle button 22 times. It's a sliding minigame where you have to slide all the numbers in numerical order from top left to bottom right, starting with the number 1. I think it's awesome that they added this back into the 20th anniversary, and that they changed the graphics and everything here to be more in line with the PSP remake. I also really like the song here as well. It fits the vibe and mood of the minigame, and it makes the inclusion here worth it. I know the Android version is the only version to not include the minigame, which I think is kind of crazy, as this minigame is in a way synonymous with FF1. Not to mention, I do feel it's a bit overlooked when it comes to the quote-unquote evolution of the minigames in Final Fantasy. It might be a bit of a stretch here, but personally, when you think of stuff like Triple Triad, Blitzball, or hell, even the Gold Saucer, I can't help but think back to this minigame as being the blueprint of sorts when it comes to minigames, with effects in-game for Final Fantasy. Now, with all that being said, I'm a bit of a hypocrite because I didn't access the minigame during my playthrough. It wasn't because I didn't know about it or think it was necessary, I just knew I was terrible at it. So I figured brute forcing the game for a potion wouldn't be the best course of action. Still, it's one of the things I love about Final Fantasy minigames. If you want to engage with them, you can. If not, you aren't shackled because of your inability to complete them. They're fun distractions with rewards if you engage long enough with them. Something kind of lost on Rebirth, which went a bit too overboard for my liking with minigames, but hey, at least they listened to fan feedback and made sure to cram as much as possible in there. Here's hoping Part 3 can nail the sweet spot. If you are able to figure out the puzzle, you'll receive various rewards in 3 tiers, with the first place being 30 seconds or less. You'll be rewarded with a Mega Elixir. Second place being between 1 minute and 30 seconds, and you'll get stuff like Elixir and Turbo Ethers, etc., etc. Third place being between 2 and 1 minutes, and you'll receive prizes like Red Curtains and Blue Fangs. Anything higher than 2 minutes, you'll receive lower level items like potions, antidotes, etc. If you are curious as to what items you can find during these minigames, there are quite a few detailed lists that go over everything you can win. I'm hoping to beat this minigame someday, but it appears as though today will not be that day. Final Fantasy 20th Anniversary Edition does have a lot of things in it that I like, but there are aspects that really stuck out to me that borderline on nitpicky to not being a huge fan of. For all the new updates to the game, there are a few shortcomings that I noticed pretty quick upon jumping into the game. The first, and this is 1000% a nitpick, but it's that the only way to change your avatar on screen is to switch your formation in the menu. In these classic Final Fantasy games, you always had the ability to switch who you're controlling in the overworld. It's a nice touch, such, and it helps with the variety and keeps things fresh when you're walking around the overworld. The issue here is that in most other classic Final Fantasy games, on the SNES for example, you normally only need to press like a shoulder button to swap your characters. Here, however, you need to change your formation in the main menu. In doing so, you have to sit through this animation of the characters swapping spots. That takes way longer than it should. In the grand scheme of things, it's really only a minor inconvenience, but it just makes me kind of scratch my head why they did it like this instead of having your world map avatar and battle formations separate, as this change does affect placements in battle. Truthfully, your character's speed will be where their turn order actually happens when in the game, but if you're like me and your muscle memory is a certain way, it could take some time getting used to selecting spells and attacks in battle if you make the switch from, say, the warrior to the black mage, where they're at on their line in the battle formation. Throwing off your rhythm and making you go back and reselect character abilities because you had your mage do a physical attack rather than a spell. Again, it's a me thing and only a minor inconvenience, but it made me just not want to swap out characters around, as it became easier to leave things as they were so I wouldn't have to think much about where the spells and such were at. Also, having to sit and watch the animation every time I wanted to play a different party member on the world map would discourage me from doing it that often. This might be a nitpick, but it was something that definitely bothered me as I played through the game. Since up to this point, it just seems like a very easy fix, especially since not all of the buttons are in use as you play the game anyway, especially on the world map. Funny enough, and despite not being a fan of the need to swap up my characters because of muscle memory, and why I only put that as a nitpick is because the enemies can be so weak in the game that you'll be holding the X button just to go through battles faster. You'll be doing this more often than actually choosing spells because physical attacks, even by mages, can actually one-shot a lot of the regular mobs and enemies in the game, especially towards the latter half, which is, I mean, it's okay, I guess, but where my actual complaint with this starts is that the encounter rate with the enemies is so high, a lot of your gameplay is going to look very, very similar. And truth be told, when it came to looking at footage to put in here for the game and this particular review in general, I was spoiled for choice just because there were so many encounters in the game that I ended up having more footage of encounters than I was able to actually put in this particular video itself. I've alluded to this quite a bit up to this point when going over the story, but the encounter rate is very much a product of the time, and it can be really annoying, especially towards the later half of the game and in the optional dungeons. It's not as bad as entering a trap room in FF2, but the encounter rate here is extremely high, legitimately to the point where there are plenty of instances of needing to face multiple groups of enemies just to leave a room. It can start to grate on you after a while, and although it's great you can save anywhere in the game, I shouldn't want to just because the encounter rate has whittled down my patience to the point that I want to turn the game off and, I don't know, go for a walk or sit on the sidewalk or, I don't know, something. Aside from the encounter rate being really high, the other negative point with the game is that there's no way to tell what buffs you have equipped on your character. Sure, after casting Temper or Haste, there will be a glow effect on your character. However, this glow is only registered to your most recent buff. You still have access to your other buffs, but you lack any sort of visual representation of what you have on your character or in any of the menus. This can make it hard to tell what you have currently buffed on your party, and including if you're trying to do more than one of the same buff, you're not going to know how many times you've actually buffed a person, so it's up for you to keep track of that. Some sort of visual indicator or even a sub menu would have been great, especially in situations where you have multiple buffs going on and you don't want to leave something off that could help you from an either defensive or offensive standpoint. With all that being said though, I do think the positives that I talked about in the core review do outshine the negatives here, and although not perfect, the game does execute for the most part itself well. On Metacritic, Final Fantasy 20th Anniversary Edition received a 67 critically and a 6.9 for the user score, which both were surprisingly lower than I thought they would be. I gave this a 7.4, so in fairness, I rounded down and gave the game a 7, which I still think is a good score. Looking at reviews for the time, it seemed a lot of the gaming journals looked at this as simply being a port of the GBA Dawn of Souls game. They also didn't like the fact that both 1 and 2 were sold separately on the PSP, which to be fair at the time when these released, I too remember being pretty annoyed by that as well. This is actually one of the reasons that I find looking at the critic scores from back in the day interesting, because it's curious to see what the quote-unquote popular consensus was at the time, and kind of looking to juxtapose its standing today with how people may view it, and my opinion, of course, with so much time that's passed. That being said, and especially for critic reviews, I always encourage anyone else to form their own opinion before paying too much mind what others. I have to make a special shout out and mention to this review from Digital Entertainment News when they brought up Parasite E3, which did come out as well. And, well, we'll get to that one eventually. Spoiler, I only played it briefly about 15 years ago and have almost no recollection of it, so when we get there, it will be a mostly fresh experience. Still, the user score reviewers were quite a bit friendlier than the critics despite having a similar score, and I think a lot of it just comes down to whether or not you enjoy the classic feel of the Final Fantasy franchise and whether you like the updated versus the NES version. Nowadays, the splitting between 1 and 2 isn't that big of a deal, I feel like, especially if you're playing these via emulation or even collecting them physically. So liking or disliking this remake on its own merits in its gameplay and visual/audio changes are really what's going to be the deciding factor here, whether you enjoy this game or not. A lot of this is personal preference, of course. Final Fantasy 1 isn't my favorite game in the series, and there are aspects I really like and others I'm not the hugest fan of. However, for me, there is a lot to like with this game, and I still think it holds up well today. The gameplay is fun, and I like that you can choose your classes at the beginning. There is a lot of customization here in terms of how you play through the game just with the level class selection in the beginning alone. While I might not be the biggest fan of the story overall and believe it to be one of the weaker elements, it's still one worth checking out to see if it appeals to you or not. As I mentioned plenty of times at this point, it is a classic and literally the first game in the series, so I do give it a bit of a pass since there was clearly a lot of room to grow in the future. Is Final Fantasy 20th Anniversary worth playing today? Yes, absolutely, especially if you haven't played this or the Dawn of Souls versions of the game. I'm not sure which one I would recommend over the other, as Dawn of Souls features both 1 and 2, but either way, I think you're making a good choice playing either, so personal preference on whether or not you want to play it on the GBA or PSP. Just know there are a few differences, but the big one being the final tower and super boss. As really any ports are a good place to start in my opinion, because at the end of the day, it's still Final Fantasy 1, and the game is good overall. Still, I think its place in not just Final Fantasy history, but gaming history shouldn't be overlooked. For me though, it's a good game and one worth experiencing any way you can on any version you can, as there are gonna be obvious strengths and weaknesses depending on which version you go with. The important bit is to experience one of the RPG granddaddies any way you can. My suggestion though is that if you have never played any version of Final Fantasy 1, pick a weekend and just immerse and get yourself lost in the world that helped revolutionize a whole genre. What do you think though? Do you think the PSP version of Final Fantasy 1 still holds up today? Are you more of a fan of the original, or do you prefer the pixel remasters? And as always, thank you for stopping by.